Chapter 4. A Synopsis of Bilingual Today, French Tomorrow. How then did we subjugate ourselves, or more correctly, how was it done? I'm including this chapter for those of you who may never have read my previous book, Bilingual Today, French Tomorrow, and for those who, having read it, believe it was short on proof. Indeed, it was short on proof, because proof was hard to come by in 1974-75. But there is ample evidence now for much of what has been done by Trudeau to bring about the elimination of English-speaking Canada, and I shall include as much as is reasonable in this chapter. We know that the moving force was Pierre Trudeau, but Trudeau didn't do it all by himself. The planning and mind-bending to prepare French Canadians for their takeover of Canada had been going on for at least 100 years. Let's take a moment to examine why and how. In 1759, the British, who were at war with France, arrived with a squadron of ships and a small army and defeated the Quebec garrison on the Plains of Abraham. With the signing of the Peace of Paris in 1763, French North America became British North America. At that point, many of the colony's leaders were allowed to return to France, and the remaining 60,000 French Canadians became British subjects. As can be expected, French Canadians weren't exactly thrilled with either the turn of events or their new status. From being a free, French-speaking people in a French colony, they had overnight become a conquered people in a country now occupied and governed by foreigners. The events that immediately followed were to result in French Canadians being kept in that unhappy frame of mind from that one day in 1759 right up to today. Because rumblings of dissatisfaction were already beginning to be heard from the American colonies to the south, Britain needed as much of a passive alliance with its new French Canadian subjects as possible. To obtain that alliance, Britain, recognizing the power of the Church in French Canadian life, came to an understanding with the Church's leaders. In exchange for keeping the French Canadian population tranquil, the Church would have Britain's support in continuing to control and regulate every aspect of French Canadian life other than for matters of policy. French Canada was permitted the continued use of the French language and guaranteed the continuance of denominational schools. The Church would have complete and absolute authority on matters of religion and education for all French Canadians. From that point in history, the Church in Quebec, recognizing its power, became dedicated to the single goal of avenging the French defeat of 1759. Such retribution was to include, when the time was ripe, the overthrow and elimination of the English-speaking people and the English language not only from Quebec, but from the whole of Canada. Common sense told the earliest planners within the Church that 60,000 French Canadians weren't going to topple the British Empire, and so the Church chose as its first goal a vast expansion of the French Canadian population in what came to be known as the Revenge of the Cradle. To achieve that goal, the Church used the threat of eternal damnation to compel parents to have as many children as was humanly possible. Families of 12 children were the norm, and families of 18 children were common. In the 200 years between 1759 and 1959, Quebec's French-Canadian population grew from 60,000 to over 4 million, a ratio of about 70 to 1, and that without benefit of any French immigration. The other goals of the Church during this period of breeding and waiting could be described as follows. 1. To keep French Canadians reminded of their subservience and of their long-term goal. 2. To keep French Canadians isolated as far as possible from the mainstream of Canadian life and to prevent their assimilation. And 3. to colonize selected uninhabited areas across Canada with French-Canadian settlements. The thinking and preaching of the French-Canadian Church during the 200 years following 1759 that allowed Prime Minister Trudeau to mobilize French-Canadians into action behind him in 1968 are well illustrated in the two items that follow. The first is a translation of an article written by Jean-Paul Tardival in his newspaper La Vérité in 1886. Quote, "It should be obvious to anyone who thinks about it that the French race in America will never have any real influence unless it is solidly based in the province of Quebec as a fortress. We must occupy the territory of this province, which belongs to us by every sort of title. Later, once we have taken possession of all territory in this province and solidly established ourselves here, maybe then we'll gradually extend our domain by a peaceful and legitimate expansion into the surrounding regions." 4 years after Tardival wrote that article, Father Hammond wrote of the French drive westward as follows, quote, "In spite of a tenacious English element hostile to the invasion and seeking by all possible means to prevent it, the French Canadian pushes towards the end for which he set out. The French Canadians infiltrate themselves everywhere in those counties of Ontario which divide it from the province of Quebec and continue bravely to march toward the west. The policy of the Church is to guide the movement, plan the forward settlements, establish the parish system, the parochial school, and the religious and national societies, and then to watch and wait for providential developments." In view of the last quotation, I presume we are obliged to look on Mr. Trudeau as a providential development. In order to bring about the Frenchification of Canada, Trudeau had to take the following steps: to establish a justification or excuse for his subsequent actions, to place the French-Canadian government and all of its agencies in French-Canadian hands, to divide up English-speaking Canada into its ethnic minorities by the device of multiculturalism, to colonize the 9 predominantly English-speaking provinces with French Canadians from the province of Quebec, to mobilize French Canadians across Canada to convince them that their day of destiny had arrived, and to set in motion the devices that would result in a French takeover of the governments of the 9 English-speaking provinces, to make the province of Quebec untenable for all but French Canadians, to brainwash the parents and children of English-speaking Canada into believing that French immersion schooling was essential for their own good and for the good of the country, to control immigration to Canada for the purpose of outnumbering the English-speaking population with French-speaking immigrants and with others amenable to learning French, to make French a legal language in the workplace of the private sector across English-speaking Canada, to take over the private sector of Canadian business and industry, to convince the outside world that Canada is now a French-speaking country, to entrench the French fact in a new Canadian constitution so that the Frenchification process could not easily be reversed, to establish a secret police force to prevent any subversive moves by English-speaking Canadians to reverse the subversive process that we are now examining. Let's look at those steps one at a time to see how they were achieved. First, establishing justification for Trudeau's subsequent actions. The Official Languages Act was the only piece of legislation that passed through Parliament that related to the language issue in Canada. That act required federal institutions to provide services to the public in both official languages at their headquarters in the National Capital Region and in places where there is any significant demand. The act gave little indication of what was to follow. 2. Putting the Canadian government and its agencies into French-Canadian hands. On taking office as Prime Minister, Trudeau appointed his associate Gerard Pelletier as Secretary of State. In contrast to the U.S. Secretary of State, which deals with foreign affairs, the Canadian Secretary of State is a catch-all for internal affairs and covers such items as protocol. In that office, Pelletier became head of the Public Service Commission and of a new office called the Commissioner of Official Languages. The Public Service Commission is in fact the personnel department of the federal government civil service. In each federal government department or ministry, directors or directors general for bilingualism were appointed, and these individuals, who would be responsible for implementing the requirements of bilingualism within their own departments, reported to Pelletier's people. From Pelletier, the word went out on bilingualism, and the word was not disputed. In each government department, individual jobs were examined to see whether they could be classified as bilingual positions, the criterion being, does this job have any contact with the public? Since any civil servant who has a telephone on his desk is liable to have contact with the public, it quickly became apparent that all government jobs were subject to being made bilingual at the whim of Mr. Pelletier. But where were the bilingual people to come from? Since few English-speaking Canadians spoke French, and because most French Canadians spoke some English, it was obvious that the bilinguals to fill this new bilingual requirement were going to come from French Canada. Between 1968 and 1977, despite a public undertaking by Trudeau to reduce the size of the federal civil service, the numbers were increased from 239,000 to 254,000, virtually all of them recruited from Quebec. But those numbers give no indication of the numbers of English-speaking civil servants who were being replaced by French Canadians. In the 20 years since Trudeau came to power, more than half of the civil service of 1968 will have retired and have been replaced by recruits from Quebec. But whatever the actual numbers are, it doesn't matter, for the Trudeau government subsequently decreed that all English-speaking civil servants who could not or would not learn French were to be dead-ended in their existing jobs. In other words, they would not be promoted and would hold their jobs till they retired or quit, at which time they would be replaced by French Canadians, which is precisely what is happening today. Indeed, Trudeau, in one of his more expansive moods, stated that English Canadians who didn't want to learn French would be left to run the elevators. The only problem was, most of Ottawa's elevators were automatic, and those that weren't were already designated as bilingual jobs. Exactly the same story applied to the Canadian Armed Forces, to the RCMP, and to some 500 Canadian corporations that had been bought up by the Trudeau government for the sole purpose of delivering them into French-Canadian hands. For the sole purpose of pretending that English-speaking Canadians were being given a fair deal, some 900 French teachers were hired from Quebec by the Secretary of State, and language schools were set up in Ottawa, Saint-Jean, and Quebec City for English-speaking civil servants. The teachers so hired became full civil servants themselves and were permitted to count all prior teaching time in Quebec as qualifying service for their government-indexed pensions. The language teaching scheme was an abject failure, just as it was intended to be. Those scores of thousands of English-speaking civil servants who took the language training and who failed to reach a satisfactory standard of French could now be told quite barefacedly that they could no longer be considered for promotion because they lacked the second official language. The fault was theirs. The language courses also served as a device to move key civil servants from their jobs and offices so that they could be replaced by francophones in their absence. On their return, the original incumbents were shuffled into dead-end jobs. At the same time that the government was ridding itself of unilingual English-speaking Canadians, it was recruiting unilingual francophones. Since the name of the game was to make the Canadian government a working French language entity, English wasn't that important. A device called Franco-banks came into being, in which French Canadians were hired by the government to await job openings that didn't yet exist. Unqualified French Canadians were hired for scientific and technical jobs and then sent to university to become qualified, while already qualified English-speaking Canadians went jobless. This, then, is what was happening in our federal government yesterday and is happening in our provincial governments today. 3. Multiculturalism dividing English-speaking Canada. For most of the 200 years since 1759, French Canadians have identified all non-French Canadians, whether they were Polish, Ukrainian, or starving Irish immigrants, as les maudits Anglais, the damned English. But suddenly, about the time Trudeau came to power, some bright soul realized that English-speaking Canadians weren't all English at all, but a mixture of many peoples, primarily from all corners of Europe. When the bilingual issue began to provide special privileges for French Canadians, Canadian Ukrainians let it be known that they too were bilingual. Suddenly the Trudeau regime saw the opportunity to split English-speaking Canada into as many factions as there were peoples of different ethnic backgrounds. From that moment on, Canada became not a melting pot like the United States, but a cultural mosaic. Within the Secretary of State's department, a section was formed to recognize and fund Canadian multiculturalism. Today, that section has advanced to a full-blown government department, complete with a Minister of Multiculturalism. The message from the Trudeau government to the multitude of ethnic associations now sponsored across Canada, the message is clear. We recognize your right to retain your culture in Canada, and we will protect you against the Anglos who would deprive you of your culture. Just keep us in power, and we will look after you. Indeed, they will be looked after up to the point where their collective vote is no longer needed. 4. Colonizing the 9 English-speaking provinces with Francophones. If Quebec were to be half emptied of its French Canadians today, Quebec would still retain its electoral districts for the House of Commons, almost enough to guarantee the re-election of Trudeau's political party in any federal election. Across the rest of Canada, the vote is evenly split between Liberals and Conservatives. If the Liberal vote could be even minimally augmented across those 9 provinces outside Quebec, Trudeau's party could remain in power indefinitely. That is one of the 2 reasons for moving hundreds of thousands of French Canadians at government expense from Quebec out into the other provinces. The second reason, which we will examine shortly, is to bring about institutional bilingualism within the governments of those 9 provinces. The colonization of those 9 provinces with French Canadians from Quebec was brought about as follows. In the early 1970s, after having appreciably augmented the numbers of French Canadians in the RCMP and Canadian Armed Forces by heavy recruiting in Quebec, Trudeau moved significant numbers of those French-speaking individuals to military bases across Canada and then decreed that not only did all of these bases have to function in both languages, but the children of these people had to be schooled in French. As a result, a whole French-Canadian corps of service employees had to be fitted into military bases across Canada. But that was just the beginning. Shortly afterward, Trudeau decreed that the civil service of the Canadian government was to be decentralized across Canada. As I stated earlier, in mid-September 1975, Mr. Jean Chrétien, one of Trudeau's top lieutenants, announced that decentralization of the Canadian federal government services had the highest priority of the Canadian cabinet and must be completed in 1978. In fact, the process is still going on today. In reality, this piece of strategy meant that large Canadian government offices were now established in every city across Canada, with special emphasis on the provincial capitals. In addition, smaller Canadian government offices were established in virtually every town across Canada. Like all Canadian government offices anywhere except in Quebec, these offices had to be functionally bilingual, which meant that they were staffed to a large extent by French Canadians. That move, in turn, meant that those French Canadians had to have their children schooled in French schools, which meant that French teachers also had to be moved across the country from Quebec. Having moved massive numbers of Quebecers across English-speaking Canada, Trudeau had to ensure that they retained their French-Canadian identity and purpose, and to that end, French cultural centres were established by the Canadian government in every city across Canada. As well, Canadian manufacturers now had to label their products in French as well as English, and Canadian firms doing business with the province of Quebec had to correspond in French and provide their invoices in French. French advertising firms came into being in all of the major cities to cater to the need for French labeling. French Canadians now had to be entertained and kept informed, and thus chains of French-speaking radio and television stations and newspapers had to be established from Halifax to Vancouver, all of them brought into being by the Trudeau government and paid for by the Canadian taxpayer. 5. Mobilizing French Canadians to take over provincial governments. Long before Trudeau was born, there already existed dozens of French Canadian communities across Canada's 9 English-speaking provinces. Usually in rural settings, these communities had been established years before by the church in its drive westward. Most of these communities had, with their own church and schools, remained intact. Others had, to a considerable degree, been assimilated into the life of adjacent English-speaking communities. Most of the French Canadians in those communities spoke and speak English as well as you or I do. On arrival in power, the Trudeau government secretly began to use political agitators, most of them recruited from the University of Montreal, who with the full cooperation of the Church began to visit and organize those communities. The purpose of these agitators, euphemistically called social animators, was to inflame French Canadians with the wrongs they have suffered under Anglo domination and to organize them into federally funded French Canadian associations in each province. The purpose of the provincial associations in each province is to demand their rights to be schooled in the French language regardless of numbers, to work in the French language in any job they happen to be in, to be served in the French language by each provincial government, and eventually to take over each provincial government through the device of official bilingualism. Subsequent to my first book being published, I received a letter from a French-speaking English-Canadian woman who had managed to get into one of these meetings. She said that the message of the meeting was loud and clear, and it was, "We intend to have this country if it takes 200 years. But thanks to the complacency and gullibility of English-speaking Canada, the job is nearly done, and it has taken only 20 years." Following publication of my second book in 1980, I appeared on a radio phone-in show in Hamilton. One woman phoned in and said, "I am half French and half English, but my children belong to the French-Canadian Association of Ontario. They have been told that for the moment they are to keep a low profile, but their ultimate goal is to take over the government of Ontario." Perhaps this is a good time to digress and cover a few of the things that happened when my book, Bilingual Today, French Tomorrow, was published. When the book first came out in March 1977, I was in Spain, and I didn't get back to Canada until a few months later. By then, threats had begun to descend on the publisher from some of Canada's Liberal senators. Several senators threatened the publisher with big trouble. Senator Robichaud, the ex-premier of New Brunswick, phoned to suggest that I belonged to Uganda with Idi Amin. Despite the threats of serious trouble that descended on the publisher, nothing happened, not overtly. When I wrote the book, I accepted the risk of being sued by the Trudeau government. but I was certain enough of what I had described as a conspiracy to put the whole of Canada into French-Canadian hands, and of the means by which it was being done, that I hoped I was reasonably safe. When I arrived back in Canada in early May, there were invitations to appear on 2 radio open-line shows and a TV program. The first of these was at a Niagara Falls radio station, and I went. The calls were so one-sided in favor of a separate Quebec that, in fairness to other points of view, the show's host, John Michael, decided to phone the head of the French-Canadian Association of Ontario for his views on the subject and on my book. This fellow, a lawyer whose name doesn't need to appear here, came on loud and clear, saying that the book was disgraceful and that his association was going to do everything in its power to see that the book was destroyed. When he finally stopped for air, it occurred to me to ask him whether the French-Canadian Association of Ontario received funds from the federal government. He hesitated, and then he replied, "Yes, it does." "How much?" I asked. "Enough," he said. "How much is that?" I asked. $300,000 a year, he replied, "and I don't get any of it." This was really great news for me, for the Canadian public had no knowledge that they, through the Trudeau government, were financing French-Canadian associations in each of the provinces. I had taken an educated guess, based on not very much evidence, that Trudeau's government had been funding provincial agitators to organize and incite French Canadians for the purpose already described, but this was the first proof I had. Later, I was to discover that a question had been asked in the House of Commons on that particular subject in February of that year by Mr. Tom Cosset, MP. Figures, which I will show later, were indeed provided in a reply by the Secretary of State to Mr. Cosset, but the purpose for providing the money was glossed over, and our alert, unbiased news media paid not one bit of attention. Later, when the radio story was being checked out by a reporter from the Toronto Sun, the lawyer admitted to the Sun that he was in fact paid $40,000 of the $300,000. What interested me about that was not whether he personally was on the Secretary of State's payroll, which he apparently was, but the fact that he could lie as easy as pie. Here was a man whose job it was to lobby, threaten, and cajole individuals and groups in the Ontario government, in Ontario municipalities, and in Ontario businesses into accepting bilingualism nominally on behalf of Ontario's francophones, but in fact on behalf of the Trudeau government, with a ready facility for lying even when he had no need to do so. Imagine how he must be able to lie when pushing his cause. But then, deceit is what this whole story is about. 3 days after the open-line show in Niagara Falls, I went on another open-line show from St. Catharines. This show, also a very popular one, which was run by Laura Sabia, a woman well known for her work with women's rights, had a few days to advertise the fact that I was going to be on the air. 2 interesting things happened as a result of the show. First of all, Mrs. Sabia, who was very enthusiastic in her praise of the book during the show, was fired about 2 weeks later. There is no doubt in anyone's mind that she was fired for her outspoken attitude against bilingualism. Nor is there any doubt that she was fired because of Canadian government pressure. The Canadian government grants and renews TV and radio station licenses through the Canadian Radio and Television Commission. TV and radio stations, therefore, either play ball with the Canadian government or they get the bat where it won't do them any good. The second thing that occurred as a result of that show was that 3 unrelated people in different towns and cities in Ontario wrote to tell me that heavy static, which occurred during the program, made hearing almost impossible. They believed that the static had to have been caused by intentional electronic interference. Whether or not this was indeed done, I have no idea, but such jamming does occur in Eastern Europe, and believe me when I say that Trudeau is a great admirer of Soviet methods. Later that same day, I made the mistake of appearing on a TV show in Toronto. Having had two sympathetic hosts up until then, I assumed mistakenly that the world was that way. It wasn't. Because hard facts had been next to impossible to obtain while I was writing the book, I was accused of having invented everything it contained. I was told by the host of the show that social animators, or what I prefer to call political agitators, who I said were paid by the Secretary of State's Department to organize and incite French Canadians, did not exist. I was told that the Secretary of State, Mr. John Roberts, was a personal friend of the host, and that Mr. Roberts had stated that these people did not exist. Was I implying that Mr. Roberts was a liar, that he didn't know what was going on in his department, or that he was party to a conspiracy to make Canada a French-speaking country? I replied that I had been out of the country for 4 months, and that since Mr. Roberts came into office during that time, I didn't know what the answer was. However, I do know what the answer is now, and I can back it up by figures. The Secretary of State, Mr. John Roberts, was consciously and conscientiously causing the following things to be done to Canada through money supplied through his office as Secretary of State. He and his predecessors and his successors have provided millions of dollars to fund political agitators whose job it was to organize and incite French Canadians in every part of Canada, and to fund the French-speaking associations formed with the goal of subverting each provincial government from English-speaking into French-Canadian control. John Roberts also provided $500 million toward French immersion schooling for English-speaking children in the English-speaking provinces of Canada up to 1977. A further $850 million was allocated for the same purpose for the 5 years beginning with 1978. John Roberts also provided the basis for what is now a separate ministry to promote ethnic rights throughout Canada. This is a matter of record, and the costs are now known. The name of that game is to divide up English-speaking Canada to the point where Canadians are so preoccupied with their ethnic differences that they will be blind to the fact that they are all being assimilated through their schooling and jobs into the new all-French Canada. A few paragraphs back, I quoted the personal friend of the Canadian Secretary of State, Mr. John Roberts, who said that Mr. Roberts denied the existence of political animators paid by the Canadian government. The following year, a letter by a concerned citizen to the Secretary of State asking for specific details about the government sponsoring of French-Canadian associations and whether or not agitators did in fact exist, brought this priceless response dated the 16th of July, 1978. Quote, "From 1969 to 1978, a total of almost $6 million was allocated to Francophone associations in Ontario for the purpose of assisting the various activities of official language minority groups. There's only one official language minority group in Ontario, and it is French. Concerning your questions about animators, the Department of the Secretary of State does not employ animators either directly or indirectly. It does, however, support animation programs submitted by the Francophone community outside Quebec. Such programs may well involve the salaries of animators, but the number employed varies considerably each year." Signed by John Roberts, Secretary of State. 6. Making Quebec untenable for all but French Canadians. In 1968, the province of Quebec was 75% French Canadian by population, and there were more English-speaking Canadians in Quebec than there were French Canadians living in the 9 other provinces outside Quebec. Quebec functioned more or less as a two-language province, and most English and French Canadians there were pretty friendly to each other. The Quebec provincial government used the French language, and business and industry usually worked in English, at least at the level of management. Today, more than 1 million of the English-speaking population has fled Quebec. Today, Quebec has only one official language, and that language is French. All signs in Quebec are in French. Businesses must operate and serve their customers in the French language, and professionals must speak French in order to become licensed in their professions. Individuals may still speak English to each other, but God help if you address a French Canadian in English, unless you happen to be recognized as an American. If you should move to Quebec and want your children schooled in English, too bad. It's illegal. The entire civil service of the Quebec government and the federal government in Quebec is not only French-speaking, but French-Canadian. The Quebec government, while directly helping to finance French-Canadian associations outside Quebec, wants no part of bilingualism for itself. A petition signed in the early 1970s by 500,000 English-speaking Quebecers to retain their rights of English-speaking schooling was not even glanced at by the Premier of Quebec. When that same petition was addressed to Prime Minister Trudeau, he dismissed it as a provincial matter that he had no intention of interfering with. How did all this change come about? Very simply. In a speech, in French of course, to the University of Montreal on March 2, 1967, Mr. Trudeau, who was then the Canadian Minister of Justice, said the following, quote, "So Quebec wants more powers for French Canadians? Quebec can do what it wants to improve the lot of French Canadians as far as culture and language are concerned. Tomorrow it could adopt laws to assure the priority of French. It could even make French the only official language in spite of the Constitution." In the following 10 years, under Premiers Bourassa and Lévesque, the Quebec provincial government brought in legislation that simply outlawed the English language. Quebec had become the French fortress that was essential to the Frenchification of the rest of Canada. In those 10 years, business and industry fled Quebec, but as fast as they left Quebec, Trudeau used the financial resources of the Canadian federal government to buy, build, and subsidize French-speaking industry and business in Quebec. To any outsider, it must seem ludicrous to see English-speaking Canada prostrating itself into oblivion to accommodate French Canadians through the mechanism of bilingualism, while French Canada, in the form of Quebec, intends to have no part of such bilingualism. Perhaps by now you are beginning to understand what I mean when I say that English-speaking Canadians have been conned out of their country. 7. French immersion schooling for English-speaking Canadians. In the 20 years since 1968, the Trudeau government has spent $3 billion to provide French immersion schooling for English-speaking school children across Canada. French immersion schooling means that the children's entire education is focused toward the French language, under French-Canadian teachers, and with textbooks specially written for the program. This form of schooling has now been instituted in virtually every city and town across English-speaking Canada, and while the program is not yet compulsory in many communities, it is encouraged by every conceivable form of propaganda and enticement. In some communities, parents already have no choice but to have their children schooled entirely in French. With French immersion schooling, it is quite a simple matter to convince English-speaking children that Canada is now a French-speaking country and that French will be the only Canadian language in the years to come. The effect of such a program over a 20-year period became obvious. Why then do we need French immersion schooling? The answer is we don't. But remember Kim Abbott's experience at the restaurant overlooking the Plains of Abraham and the words of his Quebec host. "You won the battle, Mr. Abbott, but you lost the war. Your mistake was to give us our language and our religion. I can assure you that when we have power, we will not make that mistake." Earlier, I touched on the fact that the French-Canadian associations across the country want their own schools and school boards for French-Canadian children across Canada. But those schools are to be kept entirely separate from the schools in which English-speaking children are to receive their brainwashing. In other words, the French-Canadian schools are to be used for the indoctrination of an elite French-Canadian society which, through its control of all levels of government, will become the ruling class in Canada. The incidental observation that thousands of English-speaking school teachers have already lost or been denied jobs as a result of the French immersion policy is of course inconsequential in comparison to the hundreds of thousands of jobs that have been lost in government service and the millions of jobs that will be lost by English-speaking Canadians before the Frenchification of Canada is complete. 8. Controlling Canadian immigration. When I appeared on television after my first book and took the unexpected drubbing from my unsympathetic host, I was told that there was no such thing as controlled immigration, which was designed to work toward the eventual swamping of English-speaking Canada. Subsequent to that interview, I was passed a government position paper on immigration by a concerned member of Parliament. That paper is too long and too dry for inclusion here, but it showed clearly that Trudeau intended to wipe out all immigrants but those who were either French-speaking or by virtue of their cultural background could be assumed to be amenable to accepting French as their working language. I have in fact included that paper as Appendix A to this present book. 9. Making French a legal language of work across Canada. The goal of the federal government at this moment is to make the French language a legal language in the workplace anywhere in Canada, and the government has stated that this right will soon be tested in the courts at federal government expense. Consider the ramifications. When this right is approved in the courts, a French Canadian anywhere in Canada cannot then be denied a job either because he does not or chooses not to speak English. If, having gotten a job by virtue of the fact that he does speak English, the individual then chooses to speak only French, he or she cannot be fired. What happens then? In order to accommodate that individual, his supervisors, his manager, the personnel manager, and the accounting department will also have to be French-speaking. If they are not, the individual can claim discrimination, for he is going to insist on getting his instructions, personnel memos, and his paycheck all in the French language. Consider what this does for private enterprise in Canada. And since everything that is not private enterprise in Canada is already encompassed by the reality of the French fact at the federal level, and the provision of French language services at the provincial and municipal levels, there isn't too much else left in this Canada of ours, is there? 10. Frenchification of the Canadian private sector. 3 devices will result in the final total Frenchification of the Canadian private sector. The first, which I have just described, is the right to work in the French language anywhere in Canada. The second such device is the nationalization of Canadian business and industry. When Trudeau took power, the Canadian government already controlled a number of what were then called Crown corporations. The largest and best known of these are Air Canada, the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation, the Canadian National Railway, and the Federal Business Development Bank. Canadian National was already headquartered in Montreal, and Trudeau quickly moved the headquarters of the other 3 to Montreal, where they immediately came under total French-Canadian management and control. Today, it is virtually impossible for an English-speaking Canadian to get a job in any of these corporations, with the possible exception of the CBC, the English division of which is used to convey the illusion, for the benefit of its English-speaking viewers and listeners, that Canada, in part, is still an English-speaking country. For the other government-owned corporations, the recession of recent years was welcomed by the Trudeau government as the means for laying off English-speaking employees and replacing them with Francophones. Nowhere is this more noticeable than in the huge Canadian National, which has scores of thousands of employees across the country. As his first step to nationalize the Canadian petroleum industry, Trudeau used the Canadian government's resources to buy out Pacific Petroleum, Petrofina, and more recently BP in Canada, and formed Petro-Canada. Petro-Canada has subsequently bought or licensed other stations and now controls the largest chain by far of gas stations across Canada. Insofar as there is not a gas station or any other element of any other federal institution anywhere in Canada that does not at some time do business with travelers, it becomes apparent that the Official Languages Act is an all-encompassing blanket for the Frenchification of all government-owned corporations. So, why did the Trudeau government acquire some 500 corporations? The answer is obvious. The third device for the Frenchification of the Canadian private sector is Bill C-72, an act to amend the Official Languages Act. What most people don't realize is that much of the policy of Bill C-72 is already in the unwritten operating procedure of the Canadian federal government. If businesses or contractors want to do business with the Canadian government today, you hire French Canadians at all levels, and you operate through agencies in Montreal. I believe the term is called coercion. No French, no business. Do Canadian businesses fight this coercion? Do any Canadians fight anything? 11. Convincing the world that Canada is now a French-speaking country. Phone a Canadian embassy or Canadian consulate anywhere in the world, the United States included, and you will be greeted in the French language. Throughout the world today, far more Canadian embassies and immigration offices are functioning fully in French than are functioning in English. If you are a manufacturer who is exporting to Canada, your products will have to be labeled in French as well as in English before your product can be displayed for sale in Canada. Visit Ottawa. You will be served at the airport, as at all other Canadian airports, by French Canadians. The customs agent will be French Canadian. Your hotel clerk will be French Canadian. Despite the fact that Canada is still nearly 75% English speaking, the Trudeau government policy in Ottawa and abroad has convinced the world that Canada is now a French-speaking country. Within Canada itself, French Canadians know that Canada is a French-speaking country or soon will be. The President of France knows that Canada is soon to emerge as one of the greatest French-speaking nations of the world. The only people who don't yet know the truth are English-speaking Canadians. Vaguely, they know that they are not welcome in their own government or the military or the national police force. They haven't yet come to realize that they won't be tolerated for much longer in either provincial government service or government-owned corporations or the Canadian private sector of commerce and industry. A strange paralysis seems to be gripping the English-Canadian mind. When my first book came out, the well-known columnist Doug Fisher said that the conspiracy I had described didn't exist. When my second book came out, he said in effect that the same conspiracy still did not exist, but that it was too late to do anything about it. I think that Mr. Fisher may have been wrong both times, but time will tell. 12. Entrenching the French fact in a new Canadian Constitution. On being returned to power in 1980, Canada's Prime Minister Trudeau had only one goal, which was to write a new Canadian Constitution to replace the British North America Act of 1867. His purpose for providing such a constitution was to render irreversible all the steps he had made thus far to make Canada a French-speaking country. In order to bring about such a constitution, he needed the agreement of the majority of Canada's 10 provincial premiers. In a publicly televised week-long meeting in Ottawa on the Constitution between Trudeau and the premiers during the summer of 1980, Trudeau simply said, in effect, "Either you agree with what I want, or I will strip you of your provincial resources, oil, mining, fisheries, and agriculture, and hence your power. Without your own sources for revenue, you will have to depend on me for handouts." To almost a man, the premiers balked entirely. But then, in effect, Trudeau said, "Okay, you can continue to control some of your resources, provided I have my way with the Constitution." The grateful premiers folded up like a house of cards. Had Mr. Trudeau simply drafted and signed such a constitution himself, it would have had as much permanence in the eyes of most Canadians as any other piece of legislation. But as usual, Mr. Trudeau was brilliant and announced that insofar as the new Constitution succeeded the British North America Act, it would need the assent of the British Parliament and the Queen. To Britain's Parliament, he said, "You have no choice. It's what the Canadian people want. Hold your nose and sign it." And they did. Thus, to most Canadians, Trudeau's new Constitution, having been signed by the Queen, is now as inviolable as the Ten Commandments. But the one article that Trudeau most wanted entrenched, the right to work in any job anywhere in Canada in the French language, was still not approved by the provincial premiers. And so, as I have already said, that particular right will have to be tested in the courts. As a matter of passing interest, the very night that the constitutional meeting in Ottawa ended, the Canadian Broadcasting Company announced that at a meeting held in Ottawa at the same time by the heads and representatives of 27 French-speaking nations of a newly formed French Commonwealth of Nations, Canada was commended as having contributed more in billions of taxpayer dollars and government initiatives to the world French-speaking community than any other nation, France included. 13. Establishing a secret police security force to prevent subversion. During Trudeau's last hitch in office, and against the wishes of the Attorneys General of 10 of our provinces, there was brought into being a secret police security force. In general terms, that police force was to have the right to wiretap, to open mail, and to carry out surveillance in any other manner it chose on anyone who is suspected of disagreeing in any way with the doings of the Canadian federal government. The same police force would have the right to enter any home or office and to seize whatever material it chose. Why was such a secret police force necessary? The RCMP had successfully looked after Canada's security since national security became a necessity. Indeed, in the eyes of the Trudeau government, the RCMP had been far too successful in ferreting out Soviet and Polish government spying in Canada, and the Trudeau government had done its best to suppress many of the RCMP's findings. Until Trudeau came to power, the RCMP had perhaps the highest level of individual and collective integrity of any police force in the world. Why then a secret police force for Canada? I suspect the reason is the same as for having a secret police force in any other country in the world, to reduce the individual citizen from a person to an unquestioning subject of the state, or worse. Just as everything else Trudeau did to Canada, I find this latest move frightening. We have now seen in the briefest of terms what Trudeau did to Canada and why he did it. I would like to conclude this chapter by trying to show how Trudeau did what he did to Canada and how he got away with it. I said at the beginning of this chapter that the Official Languages Act was the only piece of legislation that ever passed through Parliament on the subject of the Frenchification of Canada. That act promised no more than to allow French Canadians to be able to address their problems to the Canadian federal government in the French language. The fact is that such a right already existed, and thus little concern was given to that particular piece of legislation. Besides, who, as a fair-minded Canadian, would oppose such a right? But from that moment on, very strange things began to happen in Canada, virtually all of them by secret cabinet directives, without either the approval or knowledge of Canada's Parliament. To understand how the Canadian Parliament could be thus bypassed, we need a rudimentary knowledge of the workings of the Canadian government. The Canadian government is comprised of the Prime Minister and his own selected cabinet, all of whom must first be elected members of Parliament. The job of the Prime Minister with his cabinet is to manage the country in accordance with existing legislation and with any new legislation they may wish to steer through Parliament. Parliament itself is intended to decide on legislation and to approve annual funding to permit the government to function. If the Prime Minister's party holds a majority of seats in the House of Commons, the Prime Minister is assured passage of any legislation and funding he wants. In addition to the House of Commons, there is also a Canadian Senate comprised of permanently appointed political favorites. Although the Senate reviews legislation passed by the House of Commons, it has no power to veto such legislation. The Senate is therefore effectively without any power whatsoever. Individual members of Parliament are similarly devoid of power once a Prime Minister has been sworn in. Members of minority parties have absolutely no power, and members of the majority party are subject to every whim of the Prime Minister. Recalcitrant party members are simply not allowed to represent their party at the next election, and thus they lose their jobs and perhaps their pensions. The only exceptions to those generalities occur when the Prime Minister's party assumes power as the result of having a plurality rather than a majority of members in the House of Commons. At that point, the minority parties have a measure of bargaining power which can be very easily manipulated by a clever Prime Minister. From the setup I have described, one needn't be a student of government to conclude that a devious Canadian Prime Minister wouldn't have any trouble whatsoever in establishing a dictatorship, and that is precisely what Trudeau did. On assuming office, he selected his cabinet, with French Canadians not only in the majority, but in the strategic cabinet posts, and then swore the cabinet to permanent secrecy on all matters discussed in cabinet. In the 20 years since then, despite many changes within the cabinet, sworn secrecy has been the rule, and French Canadians, with a few temporary exceptions, have occupied the key roles of defense, communications, internal affairs, Secretary of State in Canada's case, finance, immigration, policing, Solicitor General, employment, and culture. English-speaking Canadians, for the benefit of the English-speaking electorate, have been sprinkled throughout the cabinet in such innocuous posts as Agriculture and Postmaster General. If the power of the House of Commons wasn't already pitiable, Trudeau in one quick move stripped the Commons of all power. Heretofore, the only means of control of the Canadian government by the House of Commons had been the responsibility for the examination of the government's fiscal estimates and expenditures by individual members of Parliament and the right to debate formally such estimates. In one sweeping move, Trudeau told the House of Commons that such detailed examinations of estimates and expenditures was too time-consuming for such an august body, and that henceforth estimates would be lumped into general categories and then examined and approved for Parliament's rubber stamping by a committee which he himself would appoint. From that point on, Canada's members of Parliament had no right whatsoever to know what Trudeau and his cabinet were doing with billions upon billions of taxpayer dollars, and what is more, they had no possible way of finding out what was being done to the country. From then on, with all the money he wanted at his disposal, Trudeau began to govern Canada by secret cabinet decisions, except for items that he wished to raise in the House of Commons for their political value. To those readers who still refuse to believe what Trudeau has done to Canada, this business of Trudeau's having been able to bypass Parliament completely is of fundamental importance in understanding how Trudeau managed to bring the whole of Canada under total French-Canadian domination. Canadians who don't yet accept what Trudeau has done to Canada are skeptical because they believe that their members of Parliament wouldn't permit such things to happen. The fact is, their members of Parliament don't know what is being done to Canada by the Canadian government, except for what they read in the newspapers or see on television from government press releases. The only other way that MPs know what is happening is when their constituents write to them to tell them of particular occurrences. But why do members of Parliament not know what is going on? The answer is very simply that Trudeau had no reason to tell them anything other than what he wanted them to hear. By having given up their right to question government expenditure, Canada's Parliament created a dictatorship for which Parliament itself was nothing but a window dressing. If the foregoing description of how the Canadian government operates sounds like a bit of a fairy tale, let me quote from a newspaper article written by a Canadian Member of Parliament. The item was printed in the Peace Arch News in British Columbia. It was written by Mr. Benno Friesen, Member of Parliament for Surrey White Rock, and the date was July 13, 1977. I have Mr. Friesen's permission to reproduce it. Report from Ottawa by Benno Friesen, MP. There are days when I feel really great about our Canadian future. This past week was like that. Canada Day celebrations were enthusiastic. I continually met happy, creative people making a wholesome contribution to our country. But today, I don't feel so great. I have before me a letter I received from the editor of a small monthly paper in Ontario. His name suggests that he immigrated from Europe and possibly from a country now behind the Iron Curtain. The letter says, in part, based on information found in an article of the Toronto Sun, there have been 3,327 orders in council in 1976, and none of them were later on brought before the Parliament for discussion. For the same time, there were only 10 orders in council in England, all of them later on introduced into Parliament for approval. My question to every MP in this country is my concern for democracy in Canada. Is our ship of state still steered in the democratic way, or are we quietly slipping into a hidden form of dictating to the people? Frightening, isn't it? On the one hand, the Secretary of State tables an almost meaningless paper on freedom of information. This gives the appearance of openness. On the other hand, the Prime Minister makes 3,000 decisions without the knowledge or consent of the representatives of the people of Canada. Democracy is a fragile institution. It will remain ours only if we maintain a wholesome brand of suspicion. There are times when the criticism of the opposition may sound to the public like petty, carping jealousies, but when I receive information like that which this letter contains, the fears become real, almost nightmarish. And the problem is that it becomes so easy to live comfortably with restricted freedoms as long as the government seems to be looking after us. No longer will we have to make decisions or even exercise self-discipline. In 6 years, we will be in 1984. If Trudeau had been running a de facto dictatorship in Canada, why then did he bother with Parliament and a cabinet? By retaining Parliament, Trudeau gave Canadians the illusion that Canada was still a democracy. Only Canada's parliamentarians themselves know how ineffectual they are, and no one, least of all a member of Parliament, is going to stand up to declare that he has been gelded. British Columbia's Benno Friesen should have become a hero for having written the foregoing article. Instead, no one paid any attention to either him or his article. By retaining Parliament and by not openly declaring himself a dictator, Trudeau also hoped to improve his longevity, since dictators are notoriously short-lived. Trudeau's retention of a cabinet had just as much practical value as his retention of Parliament. While Trudeau's only goal was to turn Canada into a French-speaking state from coast to coast, during the transition the country more than ever had to be run on a day-to-day basis which would preserve the illusion of Canadian business as usual. Cabinet ministers were therefore employed to field the daily flack resulting from routine political decisions for the purpose of providing the news media and the Canadian public with items to occupy their minds. Where the real decisions were made and implemented in secret, there was no public feedback, but cabinet ministers were still needed to push the cabinet decisions through the individual government departments. The running of Trudeau's cabinet, of course, posed no problem since all members were hand-picked individuals who were in full accord with Trudeau's long-term objectives. Thus, with Canada's Parliament performing unwittingly for the Canadian public's entertainment, like so many trained seals for whatever bits of red herring Mr. Trudeau chose to throw their way, with a treasury annually refilled with pots of money to allow the making of horrendous changes, and with a cabinet sworn to secrecy to do Mr. Trudeau's bidding, English-speaking Canada proceeded mindlessly down the road to its own perhaps irreversible subjugation and extinction, surrounded by a Roman circus of expos, Olympic Games, television situation comedies, and its escapes to Florida in the winter and the cottage in the summer. If there can be anything more frightening than what has already been done in Canada, it is what is continuing to be done and what will be done tomorrow. The reason is that the methods used by Trudeau to ignore Canada's Parliament in his single-minded goal for an all-French Canada are still available to whoever wants to use them, and Mr. Trudeau's successors to leadership from Quebec have been well schooled in how to use those methods.